Power rarely collapses in a single moment. It erodes, quietly, from the inside. When leaders push authority beyond its natural limits, they expect obedience. What they often get instead is resistance they did not anticipate. Today, the United States is watching a familiar pattern unfold. A president asserting power more boldly, more publicly, less constrained by tradition, law, or alliance. From threats to seize allied territory, to public verdicts delivered before investigations conclude, to pressure on institutions designed to be independent, the message is clear: power first, norms later. But here is the paradox. These moves, meant to project strength, may be weakening the very goals they aim to secure. History teaches us something uncomfortable. When authority stops listening, systems begin to push back. If you care about how power actually works, not how it is advertised, stay with me. Because what we are witnessing is not chaos. It is cause and effect. And to understand where this leads, we first need to ask a deeper question. Why now? To understand what is happening, we have to strip away the noise. This is not about a single policy, not about one speech, not even about one crisis. This is about how power behaves when it feels threatened. President Trump's second term reveals a pattern that political systems have seen before. As pressures mount from allies, institutions, and even within his own party, authority does not retreat. It accelerates. Executive power expands into spaces once governed by restraint. Diplomacy becomes coercion. Legal process becomes public judgment. Independent institutions become obstacles to be overcome. The logic seems simple. If resistance grows, push harder. But power is not a blunt instrument. It is a network, and when one node is forced, others react. Allies recalculate. Courts grow wary. Legislators, even loyal ones, begin to draw lines. What looks like dominance on the surface may actually be fragmentation underneath. And that brings us to the real issue. These moves are not occurring in a vacuum. They are unfolding within a specific historical moment, shaped by precedent, alliances, and long-standing norms. To see why the consequences matter, we have to go back. Every political system operates within inherited rules. Some are written, many are not. For decades, American power rested on a balance that was often invisible. Military strength paired with alliances. Economic influence paired with institutional trust. Presidential authority paired with restraint. That restraint was not weakness. It was leverage. Allies cooperated because the United States was predictable. Markets stabilized because institutions like the Federal Reserve were insulated from politics. Law enforcement retained legitimacy because investigations were allowed to run their course. This framework did not emerge by accident. It evolved through wars, crises, and hard-earned lessons about what happens when power ignores limits. But history also shows something else. When leaders face declining confidence, especially among their own supporters, they often abandon subtlety. They test boundaries. They challenge norms that once constrained them. The logic is emotional, not strategic. If authority feels it is slipping, it reaches outward instead of inward. That is the backdrop to the current moment. Not a sudden rupture, but an acceleration. And accelerations, in complex systems, rarely end smoothly. Which brings us to the first point where this dynamic turns explosive. The first real rupture appears far from Washington. On a map, it looks distant. In reality, it strikes at the core of American power. When President Trump openly threatened to seize Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, it was framed as strategic toughness. But alliances are not held together by force. They are held together by trust. And that trust cracked. European partners did not simply protest. They recalculated. Quietly, methodically. Defense conversations began shifting. Joint ventures hesitated. Long-standing assumptions about American reliability were suddenly questioned. This is how power backfires. Not through dramatic breakups, but through silent exits. What was intended as a display of dominance instead triggered a deeper fear. If one ally can be treated as expendable, then none are secure. The cost is not symbolic. It is structural. Innovation slows. Coordination weakens. Strategic depth erodes. If this feels abstract, it shouldn't. Because alliance systems are force multipliers. Once they weaken, Raw power must work harder and achieve less. If you find yourself wondering how quickly influence can evaporate, pay attention here, because this crisis doesn't end abroad. It echoes inward. What ties these moments together is not ideology. It is not even personality. It is a misunderstanding of how modern power actually functions. In complex democracies, authority is not centralized. It is distributed across institutions, alliances, and norms that limit any single actor, even the president. When those limits are respected, power compounds. When they are attacked, power fragments. This is the hidden mechanism now at work. Pressuring the Federal Reserve does not simply influence interest rates. It signals to markets that independence is conditional. That trust, once questioned, becomes harder to restore. Publicly prejudging a law enforcement case does not merely shape opinion. It weakens the credibility of investigations that rely on perceived neutrality. Threatening allies does not force compliance. It invites hedging alternative partnerships, alternative suppliers, alternative futures. Each move seems decisive in isolation. Together, they generate uncertainty, and uncertainty is corrosive. Institutions begin to defend themselves. Lawmakers draw boundaries. Allies diversify away from reliance. This is why autocratic tactics struggle inside democratic systems. They activate resistance rather than obedience. Power, when overextended, triggers immune responses. And once those defenses engage, escalation becomes inevitable. That escalation brings us to the second, more dangerous inflection point. The second inflection point unfolds at home, and this one cuts deeper. For more than a year, pressure mounted on the Federal Reserve, not behind closed doors, not through persuasion, but through public force. When the Justice Department moved to investigate Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, the signal was unmistakable. Independence was no longer assumed. It was negotiable. The reaction was immediate and rare. A Republican senator publicly vowed to block any future Fed nominee, not as protest, as defense. This is a system hitting its brakes. Markets do not like uncertainty. Neither do institutions designed to outlast presidents. What was meant to clear the path for a compliant successor now threatens to close it entirely. At the same time, Congress pushed back elsewhere. War powers, military deployments, presidential discretion. These are not symbolic gestures. They are structural counterweights activating under stress. And notice the pattern. The harder power presses, the more resistance hardens even from within the same party. This is no longer about opposition versus loyalty. It is about survival instincts inside the system. When guardrails feel threatened, they stop bending. And when they stop bending, something else begins to strain. The people caught in between. And this is where the story reaches you. When power struggles play out at the top, the consequences do not stay there. They move downward, into communities, into daily life. When a president delivers a public verdict before an investigation is complete, you are not just watching a comment. You are watching trust dissolve. If you are a citizen in a skeptical community, confidence in justice begins to fade. If you are a law enforcement officer, accountability becomes politicized. If you are simply someone trying to believe the system works, doubt creeps in. And once doubt takes hold, stability weakens. Protests linger longer. Tensions escalate faster. Closure becomes harder to reach. You may not care about institutional norms. Most people don't until they're gone. This is the hidden cost of overreach. It doesn't announce itself as authoritarianism. It arrives as exhaustion, as anger, as mistrust. If you've ever felt that things are unraveling without a single breaking point, this is why. If this analysis resonates, share it, because understanding power is the first step toward reclaiming agency. And the ripple effects don't stop at home. They move outward. Globally, power vacuums never remain empty. They are filled quickly. As allies question American reliability, they do not wait for clarity. They adapt. European defense partners begin looking east. Business conversations shift toward Asia. Long-standing assumptions about joint innovation quietly loosen. This is not ideological betrayal. It is risk management. When alliances feel unstable, nations diversify. They hedge. They prepare for a world where U.S. commitments may fluctuate with political pressure. And the consequences compound. Military coordination becomes harder. Shared intelligence grows cautious. Strategic commands, once anchored in trust, begin to feel exposed. Even economic interventions lose credibility. After a mission aimed at removing Venezuela's leadership, the country is publicly labeled uninvestable. The strategic objective collapses under its own contradiction. Power, in the international system, depends on coherence. When words and actions diverge, influence shrinks. What makes this moment dangerous is not decline. It is unpredictability. Great powers can survive weakness. They rarely survive being unreliable. And as the global system adjusts, the question is no longer what the United States intends. It is what the world prepares for next. Which brings us to the future. From here, the system has three possible paths, not outcomes. Trajectories. The first is restraint. Institutions hold. Allies stabilize. Executive power encounters firm but functional limits. In this scenario, the system absorbs the shock. Damage is real, but reversible. Trust rebuilds slowly, not because confidence returns, but because predictability does. The second path is stagnation. Nothing collapses, nothing heals. Resistance hardens into paralysis. Congress blocks. Allies hedge permanently. Institutions operate defensively rather than creatively. Power still exists, but it cannot move decisively. This is the most likely outcome. Not dramatic, just diminished. The third path is escalation. Pressure increases. Norms are tested again harder this time. Institutions respond more aggressively. The system enters a cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation. In that world, every action becomes precedent. Every precedent lowers the next barrier. History shows where this leads. Not to dictatorship overnight, but to brittle governance, loud, unstable, and incapable of correction. Which path emerges will not depend on rhetoric. It will depend on whether power learns restraint or mistakes resistance for weakness. And that brings us to the final question. What does all of this actually mean?